The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, we're back on the show, and joining us is Mark Potok, Director of the Intelligence Project at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Hey, great to talk to you again.
Well, great to talk to you, David.
So I have so much to ask you about in light of the Gabrielle Giffords shooting and, of course, Jared Lee Loughner. One thing that's been coming up lately from some of the, I don't know what that I would call them, extreme circles, but certainly less credible, is this idea that Jared Lee Loughner was Jewish and therefore something. And I just don't understand what is the incentive of, among many on the right to try to confirm or indicate that Loughner, in fact, was Jewish. In other words, what kind of goal or narrative would that fulfill?
Well, the place I noticed it this morning was in an essay by Kevin McDonald, who's a professor at California State University at Long Beach and a flaming anti-Semite, a guy who writes about how Jews have an evolutionary need to undermine Christian societies in order to protect themselves and so on. So reading McDonald, what I see is, he's hoping. It's just another story that he can, somehow associate with Jewish wickedness. Aside from that, it's hard to say. I mean, the neo-Nazis are kicking it around. Of course, they're more interested in the idea that the Congresswoman was partly Jewish, or, so I'm sure there are conspiracy theories about the Jews set this one up themselves in order to, be able to attack the right wing and so on. It's really been quite something.
We're also seeing this narrative cropping up now that if we can't be completely sure that violent rhetoric or insightful comments or calls to arms were responsible for what happened and Jared Lee Loughner's actions, that somehow we shouldn't really be taking actions to calm those types of comments. And to me, when I hear that, I think, well, how could we possibly know beyond all doubt all of the factors that affected Jared Lee Loughner? To you, is that a straw man, the argument that, well, if we can't know for sure it was a factor, we can't really address it or ask people to change?
It's an utter straw man. Let me say a couple things about that.
Yeah.
Since Saturday, I've done an enormous amount of press, radio shows and so on, and much of it up against people on the political right. And it seems quite obvious that, this comes from an email from somewhere. I mean, they are all reading the same script. And now is the time to pray. We shouldn't even be talking about this. Only disgusting people on the left have these kinds of conversations. And just as you say, if you can't precisely show, how this guy was sent out by thus and such a right-wing group to carry out this mass murder, then no one can talk about it at all. But look, I mean, at the end of the day, first of all, the target is a representative, the highest representative of the federal government in Tucson. So it seems perfectly reasonable to at least look at the possible provenance of this. And, was there any political meaning in it at all? After all, it was a politician who was shot through the head. And I think that the bottom line is yes. Let me also say, by the way, that very similar kinds of arguments were made around the murder of Marcelo Lucero, an Ecuadorian immigrant a few years ago in Suffolk County, Long Island, in New York. That this had nothing to do with the community. In fact, what had happened was that there had been about 10 years of really vitriolic anti-immigrant rhetoric, much of it pushed by the chief county executive there, a guy named Steve Levy, as well as a number of other legislators in that state. And, of course, when Marcelo Lucero was killed, first of all, Levy said something to the effect, this would have been a one-day story if it wasn't for the background, which was true, but an incredible thing to say on his part. But, the point was that all of these legislators and politicians went running away from their own words as fast as their little feet could take them. All of a sudden there was a corpse in the street. So we're at the same place now. There it was 5 white teenagers who carried out the murder in a kind of street confrontation. In this case, what I would say, David, is what I see is, yes, the man was clearly mentally ill. I don't think it's possible to read through his incredibly discombobulated and difficult to understand sort of ramblings without coming to that conclusion. But, he didn't kill his parents. He didn't shoot up a McDonald's. He didn't invade an elementary school. I think it's a legitimate thing to say, did the kind of atmospherics around him influence his selection of a target? And I think that clearly the answer is yes.
And speaking of his ramblings, I thought it was interesting your comments to Tom Hartman, I don't know if it was yesterday or the day before, about this control through grammar thing that showed up in a number of different places that he seemed obsessed with. What else? I mean, that's not the first time we've heard this controlling through grammar idea, is it?
Well, what I said about it, and I noticed this on Saturday, actually, right after the shooting, and talked about it some on Olbermann's show on Countdown. What I noticed was that yes, he talks about this idea of the government controlling people through the use of grammar, and in fact, I think that comes from one place and one place only, and that is from the work of a conspiracy theorist in Milwaukee by the name of David Wynn Miller. I mean, that is precisely his theory. Wynn Miller is really mad as a hatter himself. But, I mean, he has a theory about how the government types your name out in block, capital letters when you're born. That's on your birth certificate, and they thereby enslave you.
Right.
And if only you write your proper name out by using full colons and hyphens in a particular order, you will, rip asunder the shackles that, bind you.
Right.
And by the way, you won't have to pay your federal taxes anymore.
Yeah.
So, in the case of Loughner, he doesn't get into any of the details in anything I saw, but there is a few references to this idea of mind control or control of the people by the government via grammar. And there are other things I spotted as well. I mean, one of them was he refers in a couple of different ways to the only real currency being currency that is backed by gold or silver. And that's a core idea of the anti-government patriot movement, the so-called militia movement.
And separate from the idea that, in my observation, an overwhelming majority of the ideas of calls to arms and violent rhetoric and violence as a solution to political problems comes from the right, is there something about conservative principles and ideals versus liberal that lends themselves more to using violence, if we can even separate that from rhetoric itself?
Well, I mean, I suppose one could make the argument that the political right historically tends to attack and vilify groups of people based on who they are intrinsically. So it's not merely, so it is, all black people, all Jews, all gay people, or whoever the enemy of the day is. Whereas on the political left, it's really not where those people come from, sort of what's in their genes. It's what they do, right? Are you a capitalist oppressor? Maybe you need killing or something like that. So I think it's a different kind of violence, and the targets are selected in different ways. And, my own view would be that this killing of people for who they are sort of intrinsically is even more heinous than murdering people because, you feel that they're oppressing other people. It seems certainly easier to justify on some level.
Absolutely.
The other point I'd make is, this is the rap from the right now, is that it's all the same. Yes, there's been some mean talk on the political right, but there's just as much coming from the extremist left.
The equivalency argument,
this attempt to equalize everything. So let's all just sort of be nice and, hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And I just think without in any way trying to, shill for the left or the Democratic Party or the administration or anything like that, I think it is so obvious that is objectively false. I mean, I think, I can find an anarchist in Seattle who has written that President Bush should be killed and is a Nazi and so on without any problem at all. What I cannot find is a congressman or congresswoman from the left or from the Democratic Party that has made the kinds of statements we've seen from a number of congresspeople on the right. So, to me, the difference is, sure, you can always find somebody on the left who says something that can be, sound very ugly, talk about killing people and so on. But these are not, responsible authority figures, public figures who are either politicians, or who have radio or television audiences in the millions.
Yeah, I mean, the other day I did an interview, and in creating that balance, the host had to go back to something Jeremiah Wright said, and I think that is, it shows how that equivalency is being created, and it's a way that seems dishonest to me.
Yeah, I think it is dishonest, and it just seems like a desperate attempt to paint this whole thing as as Palin said, a blood libel of the political right or of conservatism, which I don't think it is. I mean, I think it's a reasonable thing for people to honestly look at this. And, I think you have to say up front, yes, the guy looks crazy. No, he's clearly not a sophisticated political thinker who has a whole system of thought. And by the way, I don't think there's any thing to suggest that he has any connection with any group at all, including that bogus report from Fox about his supposed tie to a racist group called American Renaissance. I think there's nothing to that at all.
That's right.
Yeah, so I don't think, it's fair to describe him as sort of completely emanating from the political right. I think it is fair to say he seems quite ill, but to have absorbed some particular ideas from the right and probably generally to have absorbed just the rage against the government, which is very much a right-wing thing today, that probably helped him select his target.
All right, Mark Potok, Director of the Intelligence Project at the SPLC. Thanks so much for doing this on short notice today.
And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, we'll talk to you soon. Lewis, let's take a break, and we will be back with plenty more after this. Stay tuned. DavidPakman.com is the website.
The David Pakman Show at DavidPakman.com.